our relationship. I think at that point, things were coming down on us pretty hard, and we started to take care of each other a lot more.
Yeah. We did 72 of those shows.
Somewhere in the CBS videotape archive sits a few seconds of footage that network executives, censors, and lawyers spent decades wishing had never made it to air. It isn't a slip of the tongue. It isn't a rogue camera angle catching a stagehand in the shot. It's a full-blown explosion, set off live, in front of studio audience, on a Sunday night comedy show that was supposed to be safe, wholesome family entertainment. For years, people who stumbled across the clip online assumed it had to be staged, sweetened in post, or exaggerated by internet retellings. It wasn't. Every bang, every puff of smoke, every stunned expression on the faces of the people standing on that stage was real, captured live by cameras that had no idea what was about to happen. To understand how something that wild slipped past the most heavily monitored show on American television, you have to go back further than that one night in September of 1967. You have to start with two brothers, a folk act gone sideways into comedy, and a network that had no idea what it was unleashing. Tom and Dick Smothers were born into a military family that had already been marked by tragedy before either of them was old enough to remember. Their father, an Army officer, was captured during the fall of the Philippines in the early days of World War II and spent years as a prisoner of the Japanese. He did not survive the war, dying during the chaotic final months of the Pacific Campaign as prisoners were being transferred between camps. Their mother was left to raise two young boys largely on her own, moving the family to California, where money was tight, and the boys learned early to entertain themselves and, eventually, each other. That upbringing shaped something essential in their later act. The sense that laughter and hardship were never far apart, and that the safest way to say something true was to wrap it in a joke. By the late 1950s, Tom and Dick had drifted from a college folk group into a nightclub act built around music and banter. They landed a short booking at the Purple Onion, a small basement club in San Francisco, and what was supposed to be a brief run turned into months of packed houses. Audiences weren't just responding to the songs. They were responding to the bickering between the brothers, the way Tom played the dim-witted innocent and Dick played the exasperated straight man, needling him in front of crowd. It wasn't scripted so much as it was rehearsed spontaneity. Two siblings who had genuinely spent a lifetime annoying each other, now getting paid to do it on stage. Their momentum built through the early 1960s comedy albums, television guest spots, and a growing reputation as performers who could be funny without being crude, sharp without being mean. By the mid-1960s, CBS had a serious problem on Sunday nights. NBC's Western drama bonanza was dominating the time slot so thoroughly that it had already knocked off two previous CBS offerings. Network executives were desperate for something, anything, that could pull younger viewers away from the Ponderosa. The gamble they landed on was counterintuitive. Hand a Sunday night variety hour to two folk-singing comedians who looked like they'd stepped out of a barbershop quartet. On the surface, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, which premiered in February of 1967, looked like exactly the kind of unthreatening program CBS wanted. Ed Sullivan introduced the brothers as clean-cut, all-American types. Within a handful of episodes, that image cracked wide open. Tom, who had negotiated an unusual amount of creative control before signing on, started pushing the show toward material CBS hadn't bargained for. Jokes about Vietnam, digs at sitting politicians, musical guests whose politics were, by 1967 network standards, radioactive. It worked. The show beat Bonanza in the ratings within its first weeks on the air, and it did it by attracting exactly the young, disaffected audience that advertisers were desperate to reach. But that same audience wanted material the network had never allowed on a variety show before, and Tom Smothers, stubborn and increasingly emboldened, was determined to give it to them. The writer's room became a launching pad for people who would go on to define American comedy for the next generation. A young Steve Martin, Rob Reiner, a pre-SNL Lorne Michaels, and others who would later shape shows like Saturday Night Live and All in the Family. What made the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour dangerous, from CBS's perspective, wasn't any single joke. It was the pattern. Week after week, the brothers found new ways to smuggle real political content past standards and practices, and week after week, CBS censors pushed back. Folk singer Pete Seeger had been effectively blacklisted from network television for the better part of 2 decades because of his ties to left-wing politics. When the Smothers Brothers booked him for their second season, it was itself a statement. Seeger performed Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, a song widely understood as a direct swipe at President Lyndon Johnson's handling of Vietnam, and CBS cut it from the broadcast before it aired. The backlash was loud enough, and Tom was vocal enough about what had happened, that the network relented and let Seeger perform the song again months later, and censored, in front of millions of viewers. It was one of the first times a blacklisted performer had been allowed to deliver an explicitly political message on a major network. And it wasn't an accident. It was a fight the brothers picked and won. They kept picking fights. Harry Belafonte was booked the following season for a segment pairing a performance of Don't Stop the Carnival with footage of police violence against anti-war protesters outside the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. CBS cut the entire segment before broadcast and, in a move that still reads as almost absurdly tone-deaf, sold the empty airtime to the Republican National Committee for Campaign Advertising. Joan Baez, appearing on the show around the same time, tried to dedicate a song to her husband, who was about to begin a prison sentence for refusing the draft. CBS trimmed her comments down to almost nothing before the segment aired. Each of these skirmishes followed the same shape. The brothers would try to say something real, the network would cut it, and the brothers would find a way to make the censorship itself part of the story, often literally, staging sketches about censors with giant scissors chopping scripts to pieces. CBS didn't find those sketches funny either. Several of them never made it to air at all. Part of what made the show feel alive, and part of what made CBS increasingly nervous, was a lineup of musical guests the brothers brought in. Between 1967 and 1969, the show hosted acts that mainstream Sunday night television simply did not book. The Doors, Jefferson Airplane, Buffalo Springfield, Steppenwolf, and most famously, The Who. These weren't safe, polished pop acts singing their latest single and smiling for the cameras. They were bands associated with rebellion, drug culture, and a musical style that older viewers found genuinely alarming. The show also gave American audiences an early look at something new entirely: promotional films, what we would now call music videos. In October 1968, the program aired the Beatles' promotional film for Hey Jude, shot at Twickenham Studios with Paul McCartney overseeing the staging himself, followed the next week by their film for Revolution. No other American television program had shown anything like it. It was, in its own quiet way, as significant a moment for how audiences would eventually consume music as anything happening in the studio that season. None of those bookings, though, would end up mattering quite as much to television history as a single September evening in 1967, when a British band making just its second or third appearance on American television decided that miming their way through a hit song wasn't nearly dramatic enough. The Who arrived at CBS Television City in Los Angeles in September of 1967 fresh off their first big American single, I Can See for Miles, and already carrying a reputation for trashing their own equipment at the end of the set. That reputation wasn't hype. Guitarist Pete Townsend had built instrument destruction into the band's identity, smashing guitars against amplifiers as a kind of climactic exclamation point, and drummer Keith Moon treated every performance as an opportunity for escalation. Tom Smothers, who had seen the band's chaotic set at the Monterey Pop Festival that same summer, gave them free rein to do essentially whatever they wanted during their appearance. That turned out to be a serious miscalculation, though not in the way anyone expected going in. The plan, as far as the show's producers understood it, was straightforward. The band would perform, and at the climax, there would be a small theatrical explosion, a modest flash and puff of smoke timed to the destruction of the instruments, the kind of effects stagehands had rigged plenty of times before without incident. During dress rehearsal, that's more or less what happened. The charge went off. There was a bit of smoke, a dull thud, and everyone moved on satisfied that the effect would land. What nobody accounted for was Keith Moon's private conversation with the show's pyrotechnics technician. According to accounts from the band and the show's own staff, Moon thought the rehearsal explosion looked weak and quietly convinced the crew to load significantly more explosive powder into his kick drum before the live taping, on top of whatever additional charge he'd stashed in there himself. By the time the band walked out for the real performance, the drum kit wasn't rigged for a stage effect anymore. It was rigged like something closer to an actual explosive device. The band mimed through I Can See for Miles without incident, then launched into My Generation. The song built for chaos even without any pyrotechnics involved. As the performance reached its climax, Moon kicked his drums off the riser while Townsend went into his usual guitar destruction, driving the instrument's headstock into his amplifier before it came apart in his hands. Then Moon set off the charge in the second bass drum. What followed wasn't a puff of smoke. It was a genuine blast, loud enough to visibly rock the set and shake the camera operators filming it. A cloud of white smoke swallowed the stage. Cymbal shrapnel tore through the air, and a piece of it embedded itself in Moon's arm as the force of the explosion knocked him backward off his drum stool entirely. When Townsend stumbled back into view through the smoke, his hair was singed and standing on end, and yet a finger jammed against his ear, visibly dazed. Roger Daltrey, who apparently had some inkling something bigger than usual was coming, had already put distance between himself and the drum kit before the charge went off, while bassist John Entwistle barely reacted at all, standing through the chaos with what witnesses later described as complete indifference. Backstage and in the crowd, the reaction was closer to panic. Actress Bette Davis, a guest on that same episode, reportedly fainted at the sound of the blast. Tom Smothers, walking onto the stage in the immediate aftermath, in what was meant to be a moment of restoring order, found himself in the middle of the chaos instead. Townsend, still disoriented, grabbed the acoustic guitar out of Smothers' hands and smashed it against the stage floor. Smothers later admitted he was too stunned in the moment to process what had happened, focused instead on checking whether anyone had actually been hurt. When people later asked him whether the guitar smashing had been staged for effect, he was blunt about it. It hadn't been staged at all. It was real, and in the middle of it, he genuinely had no idea what was happening around him. The consequences of that night weren't limited to a dramatic clip. Keith Moon carried shrapnel wounds from the cymbal fragments. Pete Townsend has spoken for decades since about the lasting damage the blast did to his hearing, describing ringing and pain that never fully went away, even though some accounts point out that the punishing volume of the band's stacked amplifiers over years of touring likely did at least as much cumulative damage as that single explosion. What's not in dispute is that the moment became one of the defining images of 1960s rock and roll excess, footage that circulated for decades afterward as a kind of proof of concept for just how far a band could push a live television appearance before something actually broke or someone actually got hurt. For CBS, the incident was, in a strange way, exactly the kind of thing the network both wanted and feared. It generated buzz. It cemented the show's reputation as the one program on television willing to let its guests be genuinely, dangerously themselves. It also reinforced every instinct the network's standards and practices department had about needing tighter control over what the Smothers Brothers were allowed to put on air. From that point forward, the scrutiny over scripts, songs, and guest segments only intensified. By the show's third season, CBS had implemented a review process that bordered on suffocating. Every script, every song lyric, every completed videotape had to be submitted for network approval well before airing, originally 10 days ahead of broadcast, specifically to prevent the brothers from making last-minute changes that snuck controversial content past the censors. It didn't stop them from trying anyway. Writers and producers on the show developed something close to a guerrilla strategy, submitting a tame, approved version of the segment for review, and then quietly swapping an edgy material closer to airtime. It worked often enough to infuriate CBS executives, who began accusing the brothers of violating their contract outright. The tension came to a head in the spring of 1969. CBS claimed the brothers had failed to deliver a tape by the network's deadline and used that as grounds to cancel the show entirely, even though it remained one of the 10 most-watched programs in the country and had already been renewed for another season. Almost nobody involved believed the missed deadline was the real issue. Tom Smothers said as much publicly and repeatedly, arguing cancellation had far less to do with paperwork and far more to do with silencing a show that kept finding new ways to talk about the war, about politics, and about a president who reportedly complained about the brothers directly to CBS executives. A segment featuring comedian David Steinberg delivering pointed commentary on Vietnam had already been pulled entirely from the American broadcast, only to air uncut north of the border in Canada. Around the same time, a Dick Smothers impression of President Nixon, joking about ending the Vietnam War as soon as he could find the off button, reportedly did little to help relations with the network already losing sponsors over the show's politics. Major advertisers had begun pulling their support, spooked by the increasingly pointed content and worried about alienating customers. Rather than quietly accept the cancellation, Tom and Dick sued CBS for breach of contract, arguing the network had used a manufactured technicality to shut down a show it found politically inconvenient. The case dragged on for 4 years. In 1973, the brothers won, with a judge awarding them a settlement worth close to $1 million at the time, an amount equivalent to several $1,000,000 today. It was a landmark outcome, one of the first cases to establish that a network couldn't simply invoke a scheduling or delivery dispute as cover for pulling a show over its political content. The brothers had won the legal argument decisively. What they couldn't get back was the platform itself, or the particular moment in American culture that had made the show possible in the first place. CBS filled the time slot with Haw, a deliberately unthreatening, apolitical variety show built around country music and broad, harmless jokes. It ran for more than 2 decades, proof that the network had learned exactly the lesson it wanted to learn. Safe, uncontroversial programming was a reliably profitable choice, even if it meant giving up the cultural relevance the Smothers Brothers had briefly delivered. Tom, by his own later admission, took the loss of the show hard, describing years of feeling like the cancellation had knocked something loose in his confidence that took a long time to rebuild. Dick leaned into other interests, including car racing and winemaking, partly as a way of coping with the abrupt end of the project that had defined most of the previous decade for both of them. The brothers tried to recapture the momentum more than once. First with a short-lived run on ABC in 1970 that struggled to find an audience in a cultural moment that had already moved past the raw urgency of the Vietnam-era protest years. And later with a run on NBC in the mid-1970s that started with strong ratings before internal conflicts with producers and network interference wore the show down. What the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour actually accomplished only became fully clear with distance. The writers who cut their teeth in that pressure cooker environment, fighting censors, rewriting jokes at the last possible minute, learning how to smuggle a real idea past a nervous network, went on to build the next several decades of American television comedy. Lorne Michaels would carry the lessons of that show directly into the creation of Saturday Night Live. Later generations of politically pointed comedians, hosts who built entire careers on the idea that a joke could also be an argument, owe at least part of their format to the template the Smothers Brothers built and fought for on Sunday nights in the late 1960s. In 2022, the University of California, Santa Barbara accepted the Smothers Brothers' full archive into its performing arts collection. Contracts, legal documents from the CBS lawsuit, photographs, sheet music, and recordings spanning the whole run of the show.